Swami. I represent a company called Alexion, and we're here to talk a little bit about e-waste. We have an exhibit downstairs, which some of you may have seen, that's made completely out of e-waste, with the idea that it engages the audience to learn a little bit more. So we have some more information there. This session is supposed to complement that in terms of giving you a general awareness of what it is, why it is a problem, why it's something we should be considering carefully, and what we can do about it as individuals. So my first slide was basically a data mine of the articles that appeared in print, online, and basically online, since I took them on digital form, and then a word cloud with the stuff that came out of it in our. So I just wanted to see what people were talking about, what the journalists were talking about when it came to e-waste. And it presents a pretty interesting picture. So obviously e-waste features, but one sees that you have rules. You have the word environment, management, generated, electronic, tons. And then when you look at the second level, these are the words you would expect. But when you look at the second level around that, you start to see the things that really are the red flags, which you'll see later in the presentation. It says unorganized down there at the bottom. It says pollution on the left, government. So this is an area which has many interfaces, and it's important that we give it some attention for the reasons that you'll see. So let's start with what it is. So I'm sure a lot of you probably know what this is, but the government has an interesting definition of it. They say it's electrical or electronic equipment, whole or in part, discarded by the consumer or bulk consumer, as well as rejects from manufacturing, refurbishment, and repair processes. So in simple language, it's basically anything that's reached end of life that carries an electrical current. It could be a cable, it could be a device. When it no longer functions and you need to scrap it, that's e-waste. And the government does have consumers. The government does have you and me under the catchment of the rules. Obviously, enforcement is going to be difficult, but the rules cover us, not just companies. Obviously FireEye is covered, but individuals are also covered. Now, why is this a problem? Plastic waste management, solid waste management are getting a lot of attention. E-waste is a subset of that problem, but it's the fastest growing of those waste streams. So when it comes to packaging, when it comes to solid waste, the curve is already tapering downwards, and we are correcting how much we use of these materials. But digital consumption is on the rise, and so is e-waste. So if you look at e-waste, it's been climbing at about a CAGR of 13% annually for the last few years. That's the highest in the waste streams. And why is this a problem? Because we don't differentiate this from the other waste. And so collection, so if you look at the collection rates down here, a very small fraction of this waste is collected. So you have 50 million tons being generated. But even in the most developed nations, even if you take Europe, which has the strongest legislation in this area, the collection of e-waste is only 35%. In Africa, it's 0. Asia is about 15%. But India is not contributing very highly to that number. If you look at what we generate as individuals, the global average for e-waste on an annual basis is about 6 kgs per person. At first, I questioned this number. But then when you really think about it, when you add your laptop, a couple of phones, the adapters, your share of a microwave and an oven and a washing machine, your share of it, even though there may be 4 of you, that thing's about 30-40 kgs, it's got a lifetime of about 8 years, you'll cross 6 very easily. So in India, if you have a disposable income, in the upper middle class range, you'll be more than 6 kgs for sure. Why this is a major issue in India right now is because per capita we're only about 2 kgs, but this is growing. Digital India, you have to pay by phone, TVs are penetrating all the way to the villages. The 2 is going to reach the 6 very quickly, and the 6 is going to reach the 15, which is what the developed world consumes pretty quickly, within the next decade. So if we can't collect what we're generating, what's going to happen to it? So India's down there, per capita, it's only 2. Now China is probably 30-40 years ahead of us. They're already in the 15 to 20 range. So what happens when the programs that these governments are launching and our intrinsic love for electronics results in a major issue? Are we ready to deal with the reverse logistics this problem poses? So these areas the government has taken note. From 2016, there's legislation that covers e-waste. It's called the e-waste management rules. You and me are subject to those rules. Companies are definitely subject to those rules. Companies actually are supposed to file returns. So FireEye is a bulk consumer. They don't sell electronics, but you consume electronics. So FireEye has to collect their e-waste and channelize it to a dismantler or a recycler. They have to maintain records of what they disposed or how much they have on site. In principle, you could have the Pollution Control Board come here, audit you on any day, and you're supposed to have these records ready. If you're a producer, you have bigger responsibilities. You have to show that you're making an effort to collect the stuff that you sold. So India has something called extended producer responsibility, which means if I sell an electronic item, I'm responsible for trying to make sure that that comes back for recycling. So they have targets. If they sell 1 million units, the target was supposed to be 300,000. They've negotiated it down to 100,000 for the next few years. But the government's idea is that they're going to work this target all the way up to 70%. So every year, based on your historic sales, you have to show at least 70% take back. What does this cover? It covers, like I said, everything. If you look at the catchment of the rules, it's basically all of us are subject to it. Because a bulk consumer is defined as someone who has a turnover of above 1 crore or more than 20 employees. Just 20. So the catchment for the e-waste rules is actually broader than the catchment for GST. And imagine the first there was on GST. So why is this an interesting space in India? India is traditionally very good with recycling, right? But let's look at the recycling pyramid. So this is the pyramid as it stands today. You have to try and avoid using it. Very difficult. Everything else is pushing you digital. You have to pay by digital. You have to pay by whatever. Everything, all forms are online. Government subsidies are online. So how do you tell someone, no, you can't buy a computer anymore? Not possible. Reduce. If your dependency on electronics goes up, reducing the amount of electronics is difficult to do. That's a tough catch. Reuse and recycle. India still does a very good job, right? All of you in the room would be happy if you get some lightly used machine, or if you have a phone that's still working, you try and give it to someone. So India does a very good job with reuse and to some degree recycle passing that good on. However, down at the bottom, recover, treat and dispose. All these are capital intensive processes. These are plants, these are chemical processes, and we do a nasty job there. We don't have the facilities. So down at the bottom of the pyramid, really, we're terrible. So today you're generating in India about 2 million tons of e-waste. And if you look at the registered capacity of all the legal dismantlers or recyclers, it comes to about 10% of that. So 90% of today's waste is unaccounted for. There is no one who can deal with it. If we say that India will go from 2 to 7, that's at least a 3.5x growth, because 7 is the global average. If you say you go to 15 or 20, that's a 10x growth. Now, at that point, your e-waste generation within the next 5 to 10 years is going to be 9 million tons. So what happens to that difference? And more importantly, these are embedded with lots of commodities and lots of values. If they're not being treated properly, where is that value going? So today, 1.6 million tons is unaccounted. We generate the waste, we don't know what happens to it. We know that it goes into the illegal sector, but we don't know what happens to it. That could be 10 million tons. Why is this an issue? Because majority of the formal sector, that's guys like me as well, how many of us have the plants? The plants are still being developed. So the capacity to physically treat it is really absent. You have some numbers. I can say I collected so much, I recycled. But the capacity is absent. And the gaps in capacity are currently being filled in by an informal sector that does plastic, that does e-waste, that does all kinds of waste. But this is 1 million workers with no health protection, no PF, no nothing, and often women and children, because it's illegal, it's in shacks. And so this is an area that requires significant attention, because it's a health and safety problem from a human perspective, and it's an environmental problem, and those are coupled. Why is e-waste getting the attention in this area, like plastic? So plastic is very visual. You see the dolphin spot in the nets, you see that floating island of plastic. It's easy to visualize. E-waste is much less easy to visualize. 50 million tons of e-waste, a small amount if you look at it. You can hide it away somewhere and forget about it. But lots of nasty things are put into the electronics that you and we use to enable them to work in certain ways. Heavy metals, mercury, lead, cadmium. Lead is all over the place. Beryllium, chromium. These are mined from all over the place where they're distributed over large areas and then consolidated into electronics. So when you dispose these, if they end up back in the food chain or back in the environment, those go back to you and me. Lead is a deadly neurotoxin. Mercury, I don't know how many of you are familiar with minamatas and the accumulation in fish, a major toxin. So if you're not careful with what you're doing with these streams, after a certain amount of time, they're coming back to hurt you. So I put together a little example of a simple thing which you see all around you. See CFL bulbs. I'm sure that in your facility they would have been there. I'm sure there was an upgrade. Productivity, LED is so much better. What do we do with all these CFLs? CFLs all have mercury and phosphorus to help in the illumination. 2,000 units of CFL bulbs have about 10 grams of mercury. Probably more if they were manufactured in India. That 10 grams, if it's disposed improperly and ends up as a leachate, that can contaminate 50 million liters of water. 50 million. Sorry, 5 million. So 5 million liters of water are at potential to be damaged by just 2,000 units. Now you do the math on Bangalore, all the tech parks, all of them had a productivity project, all of them changed from CFL to LED, and it was sold as a great project. What happened to the bulbs? There is no recycling for bulbs. I can tell you. I'm standing here and telling you there is no mercury recycling in this country. You can hold me to it. Where did the bulbs go? How many of them ended up at least in a scientific landfill? So what happens with e-waste today? It's usually generated at high volumes, as you saw in the developed world. They also don't have facilities to deal with all that problem, and it makes economic sense to push it to someone else. So the e-waste moves from the developed world to the developing world. China, India, currently Africa. A year or two ago, China launched a program called National Store. So some of you may have seen this in the context of plastic recycling. So they decided not to be the dump yard for other people's waste. They closed their imports for all kinds of recycling. So that stuff started going to Malaysia, Vietnam, and most often to Africa, because who's controlling Africa? Africa is uncontrolled. It's a great place to send stuff. So almost all the e-waste comes e-waste. So what does illegal processing look like? Looks like this. There are fields and fields of dead electronics, and there are people smashing them or trying to get the copper from the cables. They're burning them. There are people living around these places. And just in case you think this is just a scare story, the environmental agencies have gone and finished the whole loop. So if you go to these areas and you look at the groundwater is contaminated. If you take blood samples from the people who are living around that, every single person, it said in that report, had high levels of electronic waste components. 200% more lead than should be present in an area where children are playing. So these are real problems. This Agbo Gloshi is probably now the world's most famous dump yard for e-waste. It's in Accra, Ghana. Are we doing any better? No. We're not doing any better at all. Selampur, Moradabad, these are hubs right outside Delhi, within 20-30 kilometer radius of Delhi. And the processing happens in exactly the same way. Women, children, and I've been there. So these photographs are not more scary than the place. This place is far more scary than the photographs. Those are the canals that drain into the Yamuna. And the Yamuna goes into the Ganga. And then you have a brilliant clean Ganga project. You're going to clean it from the mess you're putting in it upstream. And that's going to be pretty difficult. So, okay, what does legal processing look like? This is a snapshot of Umicore in Belgium. It's probably the flagship venture for this kind of stuff. It's expensive, it's large, and they do get e-waste from around the world because it's also valuable. However, it's hard to do in India because it's capital intensive and the feedstock is variable. You're not doing just one thing. E-waste is so many different kinds of things. And it doesn't scale well, so it's not easy to do it on a small scale. I put in 2 case studies, and this one was close to where I used to live, Tonawanda, New York. It's very interesting. So it's just an idea of what could happen. These are time bombs, and so we sit here, we talk about them, but at some point there's going to be a cash problem or a time problem or a health problem. So back in 1890, someone bought a piece of land in Tonawanda, New York, because it was between Erie and Ontario, and Niagara Falls was close by. And Niagara Falls was the only place that was generating electricity. So they wanted to be close to electricity, and they wanted to make a settlement, and they sold it as the Love Canal project. However, just at that time, AC current was invented, electricity started moving all over the place, and so the project failed. In the meantime, they'd been digging a trench. So they had a hole in the ground, and they sold it to a chemical company called Hooker Chemical Company. With the connivance of the state, so completely legitimately, Hooker buried about 20,000 metric tons of chemicals in that. And they realized that this is going to be an issue. So given an opportunity, they sold it back to the government for $1, including liability. Someone bought that, and on that dump yard, they made a settlement. And 20 years later, these barrels and chemicals started coming up. There was cancer rampant. And to dig out that site and clean it up led to the creation of what is known as the US Superfund. The US Superfund exists today as a federal fund for all kinds of emergencies, for Katrina, for all their weather-related problems. They ended up spending $400 million on cleaning up this site. Closer to home, sites 1,000 times more than normal. And legal compensation proceedings are still ongoing. And buried somewhere in the report is a statement saying 5.3 metric tons of glass containing residual mercury, 0.15% is a huge amount, by the way, was sold to a scrap recycler. So who's responsible? If you were buying something for your employees to drink, drinking water or your food, you check your vendor very thoroughly. Why should it be any different with the scrap side? Why do we have this thing that if it gets out of my facility, I don't need to worry about it anymore? So the question really is, lots of nasty stuff. Are we ready for processing? So that's really all I had. I'm going to skip these. I'll leave you with the last thing just because I like the quote. I think the road for sustainability, the stuff we talk about, it's now in self-correct mode. It's no longer about I can fix it later. It's about doing enough to prevent disasters. It's no longer about doing less harm. That's gone. Unless we actively correct the course we're on, with tough times ahead. So I'll leave you to ask any questions if we have the time. Happy to answer them.
So you were planning to do the complete recycling here? Or?
Yes. So right now we export the PCB fractions to Sweden, where they do the recycling. But the idea is to, if we can generate enough. So I think we're doing we did 30 to 50 tons last year. This year we'll probably do a little over 100 tons overall. You need to be maybe 20x, 30x the volume to be able to justify doing recycling here. So we're moving in baby steps. So today we're doing, say, cables. Tomorrow we want to do baseboards, but get into the nastier stuff as the volumes pick up. But the team that's put together is really, that's the focus. So we want to get into the recycling. Refurbishment is something we do, but it's a part of recycling, but our strength is really in recycling.
How are you managing the collection? Where all are you collecting?
Companies for now. We do a little bit of individual collections if they come and drop stuff off at our facility in JP Nagar. If they consolidate in terms of resident welfare associations, or there's some other method to agglomerate, for instance, the bins you guys have downstairs, right? If you get to a certain mass, then the logistics works out. But otherwise, it takes a negative material and drives the logistics even further negative. So our bulk consumers, producers are bread and butter. We are trying to understand models that can engage consumers, but it's very difficult.
The residential apartments also, they have a base segregation method. They do have a separate method to collect e-waste.
Right.
There is in my apartment.
Right. So we're talking to a few complexes. We're talking to Park West. We talk to Embassy and Prestige, but getting them to bring in a proper framework in every place is difficult. And in our experience, it tends to become a discussion about the stuff that has no value or negative value. So the consumer in India wants to commoditize whatever has a little bit of value and then wants to dump the stuff that has no value.
Yeah.
And we're happy with that as well. So I do tube lights. We did 2 tons of tube lights from CFTRI. I charge them and we take it. But the point is that one has to understand that it's negative.
Yes.
So, and then when you get into this with apartment complexes, they only see this as I'm doing all the negative stuff. So the apartment guy, he wants to sell his phone, but he'll drop his battery with me and he'll drop a CFL with me. So it becomes a slightly more difficult discussion, but we're having it, and we see the turn because as bulk consumers now, they're aware of their legislative obligations. So that may change the dynamic of the conversation, because until then, the dynamic of the conversation is very different.